a little worn out. So, again, it's 25 questions, 2 points of questions that same deal as that. Well, the arguments fall into several categories. I think it's good to know just what categories some of these arguments fall into. But first, you see 2 Latin terms, a priori and a posteriori. And these are terms that don't just relate to these arguments. An argument a posteriori is an argument, basically a necessary argument based strictly on the logical structure, on its own logical structure. A priori, you can see the root word of the word prior, and that's not an accident. One way it gets defined as something that's a priori is prior to and independent of experience. And that's the way the ontological argument is. In other words, it's not based on observations about the world. It's based on concepts that are independent of sense experience. Now we're going to also see this when we look at the contrast between rationalists and empiricists. So a priori is basically from experience, and a posteriori knowledge is, or an argument that's a posteriori. Basically, you see the word post or after. It's either an argument or something that is based on experience. It comes after experience. A posteriori knowledge is knowledge based on and coming after some experience you've had, or that has been related to you. So basically, the ontological argument is the only one of these that is a priori, at least of the ones that we've looked at. Okay. Now, the other arguments, the cosmological arguments, are those first 3 arguments, the first, second, and third way, are versions of the cosmological argument. And the cos suggests cosmos. In other words, a cosmological argument argues for the existence of God as first cause, C-A-U-S-E, of the cosmos, C-O-S-M-O-S. So the cosmological comes from cosmos, not from cause. And cosmological arguments are a posteriori. They're based on some observation about the world. Now, we really did not go into design arguments, but Aquinas' fifth way is a very elementary version of the design argument. And I didn't review it, but it is there in the PowerPoint if anybody wants to write on one of these, say, for your critical reflection paper or something. Look at that. Paley's argument is also, of course, a version of the design argument. And so your book is a little long when it portrays all of Aquinas' arguments as cosmological arguments. The fifth way is a version of the teleological, not cosmological argument. So they're a little careless there. Again, because you write a book doesn't mean you can't make mistakes. So at any rate, the word teleological comes from the word telos, which is an end or goal or purpose. And so design arguments or teleological arguments say, well, okay, well, this is the way Paley says it. He says, well, what's the difference between the stone that I, kicked while I'm walking across, if we were here, we'd be walking across the field. For a Scotsman, we're walking across the field. What's the difference between stone and a watch I find on the way? Absolutely fascinating program I saw last week on public television, where they found this old thing with gears in a 2,000-year-old shipwreck. I say, well, you didn't even know they could make instruments like that back then. Well, a lot of people don't. They're having to rewrite history, and they're trying to figure out, well, what was it for? Was it really from a wreck, or did somebody drop it off a later, age ship? Well, Paley says, the watch, unlike the stone, has parts that seem to function together to serve a telos, to serve a purpose, right? And of course, it's an argument from analogy. It says, well, okay, look at things like the human eye. Doesn't it have parts that work together to serve a purpose? But if the watch had to be designed by a designer in order for those parts to fulfill their purpose, then wouldn't something like the human eye need a designer? And who would the designer of the eye be other than God? Now, of course, there are evolutionary responses that try to account for a complex mechanism like the eye based on things like natural selection. But I mean, this was basically Paley. So design arguments, which we're going to say very little about, are teleological. Now, we spent quite a bit of time on this abstract argument, the ontological argument. Again, ontos is the Greek word for being or existence. And so it's an argument that moves from a concept of who God is, of what kind of an existing being God is, right? And, you know what? Just for purposes of displaying this. So basically, it's called the ontological argument then because it's based on a concept of God's existence, who God is. Now, the fool, of course, is a person who denies the existence of God. Now remember, Anselm, and even later Descartes, they're not living in the kind of pluralistic society you and I are living in. Although even in this society, pretty much the Judeo-Christian worldview is predominant, even to this day. But Anselm basically, what is the purpose of reason? Well, the purpose of developing an argument is to try to take somebody from statements that they would accept as true to a conclusion that they're unlikely to accept as true without more evidential support, without an argument being presented. And so that's what all of these arguments try to do. And so Anselm, living basically in Roman Catholic country, can pretty much count on the fact that even if somebody does not believe in God, that they pretty much will agree with him on who God is, if God were to be in, right? So the fool, again, this is based on a verse in the Psalms, is the person, the fool has said in his heart there is no God, right? It's the person who denies God's existence. So what Anselm was trying to do is to take somebody from a point where they'll at least agree with him on the concept of God, and then show that person that from that concept of God, it follows logically that the being that fits the concept has to exist. So why does he think the fool contradicts himself? Well, the concept of God's being that Anselm uses to back up here is that what? God is that than which none greater can be thought, or the greatest being we can imagine or think of, you know. And again, as even your text points out, sometimes arguments have hidden assumptions where it doesn't work to build that in. And one of the things that's going on in the background of this argument is basically Plato's assumption. He's buying into some Platonism here that something that exists is somehow better or greater than something that doesn't exist. Remember, the form of the good, was the most morally perfect thing for Plato, but also the most fully existing thing. And to be less than good is to be less than real for Plato. So buried in the background of this argument is the assumption that something that exists is greater than something that doesn't exist. And so, why must it exist? Well, here again, he says, well, take a painting. Certainly, a painting that exists in reality is somehow greater, has a higher existence, say, than something that exists just as a concept in the mind of the painter. Now he says the denier of God's existence basically says that God is like a concept in the mind of the painter, that God exists only as a concept, but not in reality. But then Anselm says, wait a second, what are we working with here? Isn't it the concept of the greatest being imaginable, that than which none greater can be thought? Well, surely whatever satisfies that concept must exist not just as a concept in the mind, but in reality also, or it wouldn't qualify as the greatest being we can think of. There would be a greater, namely one that existed in reality. It would be like the painting that exists only in the mind of the painter versus the painting that exists in reality. So how, so if the fool accepts Anselm's definition of God, what he's trying to say is, if you buy into the concept that God is the greatest being we can think of, he doesn't get to be the greatest being we can think of without existing in reality. So by having the fool agree with him on the concept of God, he should also accept the conclusion that God is the concept has to exist. Otherwise, you end up with a contradiction, because the fool would be saying, well, okay, I think God is the greatest being we can think of, but that being doesn't exist. But Anselm's trying to say, in order to qualify as the greatest being we can think of, that being has to exist, because, and here's Plato coming in, something that exists is greater than something that doesn't exist. Whereas the way one of my old grad school professors, James Cardinal, used to say, you would say, well, I have a concept of God. Anselm would say, somebody would say to Anselm, I've got a concept of God. And Anselm would say, well, and I think it's the greatest being we can think of. And Anselm would say, well, is what you have a concept of it is. They say, well, no. Whatever you have a concept of isn't a concept of the greatest being imaginable, because that being exists. is kind of Anselm's way of doing it. Now, I had a really good question from are there any questions about that so far? One response is Guanillo's response. Remember, Guanillo's a fellow monk. He also believes in God, but he's suspicious of this way of trying to prove God's existence. And what he tries to show is that Anselm's argument might prove too much. That a similar argument, similar reasoning, might enable you to prove from the mere concept of the most perfect island that island has to be out there somewhere. And that would seem weird, right? That's X-Files material, In other words, it would seem odd that we should be able to prove from the mere concept of it that the most perfect island has to be out there existing somewhere. And so this is what Guanillo says. He says, look, I could develop a parallel argument that used the same reasoning and prove the existence of the most perfect island. Now, frankly, I've never been satisfied with Anselm's response here. But Anselm's response is to try to say that somehow the case of God is unique. And Descartes incorporates this into his version of the argument. But basically, there's a difference between what Aristotle called accidental qualities of a thing and a thing's essential qualities. He said it's essential to us that we're reasoning beings. And there's a triangle, right? Now, it happens to be drawn with white chalk, okay? Now, if this were like, if I had other colors of chalk, I could draw a blue one or a red one or a green one. Well, it's not essential to something being a triangle that be colored white or blue or green. The color of a triangle is not an essential quality of that triangle. Something can be a triangle without being colored white. However, it is essential to a triangle that I have three angles and three opposing sides. Those are essential properties. So what Descartes tries to show is, while existence is not an essential property of a perfect island, it is an essential quality of God's very nature in a way that it isn't the essential property of an island. Now, here again, I don't know about this. If we're talking about the most perfect island and something that's perfect exists for Plato, then why aren't we building in existence in the most perfect island? But Descartes tries to say the case of God is unique. So Guanillo's reply, what would a similar reasoning also prove the existence of the most perfect island? Why is this a problem? Well, it shows that the reasoning in some way that Anselm uses must be suspect. In other words, if you could prove something like that with that reasoning, then you want to say there's something wrong with the reasoning. This is why it's a criticism of the argument. Now, what Descartes does is he goes with the concept of God as the most perfect being imaginable, or as the being that possesses all perfect qualities. The way they used to say it, and when I was in grad school, God is the sum of all perfections are perfect qualities, right? They say, well, God's, incorporates all perfect qualities. And so, what is he trying to show? Well, Descartes is trying to say that one of the qualities, along with being all-powerful, all-knowing, morally perfect, and omnipresent everywhere, another quality that God has is the quality of existence itself. That somehow existence is as much an essential part of God's nature as having three angles is to the nature of time. Okay? Now, the problem here is, so in order to have a correct concept of God as the sum of all perfections, you have to build in the quality of existence. So here again, you get the same contradiction if someone says, well, I agree with you, Descartes, that God, if God is around, God would have all perfect qualities, but I don't think God exists. But Descartes would say, well, wait a second, though. Existence is one of God's perfect qualities. So you can't, on the one hand, say you believe that God is the being that would possess all perfect qualities, and on the other hand, deny God's existence, because one of those perfect qualities is existence. So here again, it's the same type of argument that would land you in an outright contradiction if you accept the premise and deny the conclusion. So basically, now, Kant's historical criticism focused on the way Descartes treats existence. You say, well, that's paper. I'm not colorblind. What color is blue? You say, well, what's blue? We're predicating a property of this sheet that this sheet does not have, namely blueness, right? So when you say that something has a property, what logicians say is that's a logical predicate. We're predicating a property of that thing. We're predicating blueness of this paper, right? This paper is blue. Now, what Immanuel Kant says is that's the way Descartes takes existence. That it's just another one of God's properties, along with being all-powerful and all-knowing and those other properties. But Immanuel Kant says that's not how existence functions logically. And pretty much, contemporary logicians treat existence the way Kant said it should be treated. In other words, I could describe the qualities of my car out in the parking lot. But if I'm doing that, I don't say, well, it has, the Chevy Aveo is blue, it has, a 4-cylinder engine, this, it has 4 doors, well, you know, existence is not part of the description of the thing since it's of the manual. But it's, the word he uses is a big, nice 50-cent word. A precondition of a thing having any properties. In other words, that's what existence is for Kant. In other words, it's a condition that would have to be satisfied for something to have any properties. In other words, my car out there in the parking lot has to exist before it can have any other properties like being blue and having a, you know, four-cylinder engine or whatever other property you call. But existence is not one of those properties. So why is this a criticism of the argument? Well, the point is, you take the necessity out of the argument if you take existence out of the list. What Immanuel Kant says is if we say something doesn't exist, we reject it with all of its properties, but existence is not one of those properties. So if existence is no longer in the list, then somebody could deny God's existence without contradicting themselves. You know. Now remember, Kant is, comes from a German Lutheran Pietist tradition, a Protestant tradition. He's a strong believer in God. He even says God has to be around to guarantee the validity of morality. But he doesn't think the ontological argument works to prove God's existence. He thinks it takes us beyond any possible experience. So that's Kant's famous criticism. To put it in a nutshell, Kant says existence does not function as a logical predicate. It's not a property of the thing that is a predicate of that thing. Well, okay. Now, St. Thomas Aquinas, who also believed in God, most of us say, St. Thomas Aquinas also, you can say, well, wait a second, we got 5 ways here. I don't see a version of the ontological argument in Aquinas of 5 ways. Was there a 6th way? Well, the point is, Aquinas did not like these a priori arguments. He preferred a posteriori arguments for God's existence. And remember, Aquinas was there at a time in the Middle Ages when the works of Aristotle were being rediscovered after being lost to the Western world for about 1,000 years. So your book has the second way, but really the first 3 ways are just 3 different versions of kind of the same argument. They're all versions of the cosmological argument for God's existence. And remember, what I said before is that the overall strategy, and I probably should modify the PowerPoint to put this in. I thought doing this in the past. The form of the argument is what logicians call a disjunctive syllogism. But instead of, it's very much like the old drinking song, 100 bottles of beer on the wall, right? 100 bottles of beer on the wall. So, take one down and pass it around. You got 99 bottles of beer on the wall. And do it again. In other words, there are lots of things in life where we have to consider a few possibilities and then try to eliminate something. In fact, even doctors use an abbreviation It goes like that, RO, for rule out. Say a doctor is treating somebody, looks at their symptoms, and says, well, there are 2 or 3 things that are consistent with these symptoms, and they'll put on their notes, rule out these things. In other words, they're saying, let's do some more tests and rule out some of these options and see if we settle on one of them. Well, this is the overall strategy that Aquinas tries to use. Basically, he's going to try to say, well, there are a number of possibilities, right? Things could bring themselves into existence. The universe could be infinite and not require a first cause. And or maybe it has an intelligent, necessary first cause. So Aquinas says, well, let's look at some of these options and see if we can eliminate any of them. So that's kind of, if you put that in the background, all these 3 arguments have that overall structure that he's going to consider several possibilities, and he's going to give reasons why we ought to eliminate every possibility, but that there is a necessary first cause of the cosmos, i.e. God. Right? Now, Aquinas, as I said, they were rediscovering Aristotle's work, so he's very influenced by Aristotle. And this first way is very similar to an argument that Aristotle used to prove the existence of an impersonal God he called the prime mover. And your book tells a little bit about Aristotle's prime mover, that it's sort of an impersonal being who is not involved in the affairs of human beings, but instead contemplates his own perfection. In other words, not exactly the God of the Bible where God cares what goes on in the everyday lives of ordinary people, right? And I think it's important to keep this in mind. For somebody like Aquinas, these arguments for God are part of what was called natural theology. And for him, they're icing on the cake, right? But now, David Hume spent time in his controversial book, 3 Dialogues, not 3 Dialogues, but Dialogues Concerning Natural Religion. Yes, criticizing religious fundamentalists. But David Hume also tried to criticize people like the deists of his own day, who said, well, you know what? The ordinary people on the street, yeah, they're going to kneel down in fear and prayer, beneath an angry God, and worry about whether God accepts them, and they're going to believe, and their faith is going to be based on stuff like miracles. But we want real rational proof. We're more intellectually sophisticated than that. So we want arguments like these kinds of arguments, like the design argument, like cosmological and all that. But they also pretty much wanted the conclusion of those arguments to be that God exists pretty much as God is conceived in traditional monotheism. But what David Hume says is, look, if you try to make these abstract arguments do the job all by themselves, at least an argument like, say, the cosmological argument, without combining it with other arguments, there are more conclusions that are possible than that the God of the Bible is the first cause of the universe. And I think Hume was right in that if you try to make the arguments stand by themselves, there's a problem. Because, you know, there are more conclusions that are consistent. Now, of course, for Thomas Aquinas, since he also has his faith based on the Bible and church tradition, there's only one real option, you know. But at any rate, so this first way was based on motion, and here we're not just talking about this kind of motion. Now, I mean, potentially I could be over there. In physics, we talk about potential versus kinetic motion, right? I mean, I'm going to erase a piece of chalk, but this chalk on the edge is in potential, or this is potential energy here. If I kick it over the side, that's kinetic energy. It's very similar to what we're talking about here. But for Aquinas, motion, and Aristotle, motion can also be like development. In other words, it's going from potentiality to actuality. Consider the development of an oak tree from an acorn. This is one of Aristotle's examples. You know, basically, an acorn is a potential oak tree, but then it becomes an actual oak tree. So, so we have motion defined as going from potentiality to actuality. So here he says, okay, what are the possibilities? Well, things might set themselves in motion, right? I mean, they could just spontaneously do it. But then he says, we can rule out that option because they would have to be in potential motion and actual motion at the same time, and something has to be one or the other, in potential motion or actual motion, but not both. So he says a thing doesn't move itself, so it has to be moved by some other cause. But now, here, what he's envisioning is a chain of causes going back, you know, to the beginning of things. So you can say, well, what if that chain of causes was simply Aquinas knows that an infinite series has no first member. Just really abstract stuff, I know. But an abstract, okay, an infinite series has no first member. So Aquinas says, no, the universe can't be infinite. Now, a lot of people are very unsatisfied with Aquinas' response. But he basically says, well, the universe can't be infinite because there would be no first cause. Well, you say, well, why do we need a first cause? Why can't it just be infinite? But he says there has to have been a first cause, and so he wants God around to set things, to set all the intermediate things in motion. You know, so his conclusion then is God was needed as the first move. By the way, I mean, the steady state theory that was around when I was in college and competed with the Big Bang theory basically viewed the universe as kind of infinite. So did Plato. The Big Bang theory does not. But there is a way, and I'm just going to mention this in passing. You don't have a question on it, but there was a way that was mentioned in the video, just if somebody's curious, somebody wants to read the paper on it, where the universe could be considered infinite even if there was a Big Bang. One view that people postulated was that the universe would be what was called an oscillating universe. In other words, that we're in an expanding cycle of the universe now, right? And that's provable by, Hubble's experiments and stuff. But the thought was that at some point, and this is like a rubber band going out to its end and then being pulled back, at some point the mass of everything in the universe would cause it to go in the other direction and to ultimately collapse back on itself. And then you'd have another Big Bang. So you'd have an infinite universe that was expanding and collapsing infinitely. And we're just in an expanding state now. But pretty much, that's pretty much been put to rest. I mean, nothing seems, it doesn't seem like anything is going to come back on itself. Well, in the late 90s, when that was around as a possible objection to the Big Bang, that was credible even to very intelligent people. But research since then has shown that more or less the universe is going to be like a big firework. The thing goes up and you see it expand, and then all of the ashes burn out, right? Moving firework, and that's basically what's going to happen. It's not going to collapse back on itself. So that version of the infinite universe has kind of been shown to be not the case. Anyway, but there's still a debate. Is the universe infinite? Aquinas, though, thinks that it can't be infinite, can't have no first cause, has to have had a first cause to put everything in motion. Efficient causes, I won't spend as much time on it, but efficient causes are the same kind of causes that we talk about today, and they produce their effect. Well, here again, he says, well, could something be the efficient cause of itself? Well, efficient causes precede their effects in time. Right? The cue ball has to first hit the 8-ball before it sends it and causes it to do. So Aquinas says, well, if the thing were the efficient cause of itself, it would have to precede its own existence in time. But that's not going to happen. That's an impossibility. That's an absurdity that something would exist before it exists, right? So he says we can rule out that things bring themselves into existence, much like the steady state theory thought. So that's why I think can't be the efficient cause of itself. Here again, he says we can't have an infinite chain of efficient causes because, he says, if that were the case, there would be no first cause, but then that would mean there are no intermediate causes, and there wouldn't be any final result. So he said there must have been a first cause, and that first cause is God. Now, the third way is the most complex, and I simplify it greatly, believe me. But existence, necessary existence, and contingent existence, those are called modalities. So for a thing to be contingent, everything in this room is contingent. Nothing absolutely had to exist. There's no rule or law built into the fabric of the universe that this stuff in this room had to exist in some way. So Aquinas says, well, what if everything were contingent? He'd say, well, then everything would have to have had a beginning of existence. They says that might mean that at some point nothing existed. But now here Aquinas builds in an assumption that he doesn't tell you about, and that's that you can't get something from nothing. So he says, if there were a state of the universe where nothing existed, then if you can't get something from nothing, then nothing would have ever begun to exist. And how do you get a state where nothing exists? By assuming that everything is contingent and that there's no necessary being around. So he says you can't do that. That you need at least the existence of one necessary being. And he also has a story that I don't like, where he talks about a chain of necessary beings. I don't know whether he has angels in mind or what, but I don't like that part of his third way argument. But at any rate, so he says God had to be around as necessary for his cause. Now I'm going to skip over the fifth way because I decided for time purposes not to get in essentially to the design argument, but I thought you should at least know what it is. You know. Real quickly, we're not going to spend a lot. We did Aristotle more recently. Well, two types of virtue: intellectual virtue, moral virtue. Aristotle's convinced that we have to be reasoning beings, and we have to exercise our reason intellectually to learn more about the world around us, and also our rational abilities enable us to act morally, to overcome the impulses in our nature that would have us act immorally. So moral virtue, and again, Aristotle, like Plato, is more concerned with what it is to be a good person than with how do I decide about what to do in this moral situation. Whereas most other moral theories are concerned with figuring out what's the right course of action, what's the right thing to do in this situation. So we saw that Aristotle is very much a social, he's very sensitive to the fact that we have a social nature to it. So morality for him is not contemplating the form of the good, some abstract, otherworldly standard of goodness like Plato had. And it's not even getting in touch by your reason with the forms of things like justice and temperance. But for him, it's developing these characteristics, these character traits, in community with other people in the real world. And so he says, how do we acquire virtues? By exercising them. Just like, we learn to build by building, we learn to play an instrument by practicing it, and he says we become just persons by doing just actions. So we don't become moral in isolation, and it's not a matter of private meditation, but of our public action. Now, we saw that for him, and pretty much, most of this you probably know without even reviewing it. Note, he says a virtue is the midway point. The virtuous life is a life of moderation. Every virtue is a midpoint between two vices, a vice of excess and a vice of deprivation, of whatever that thing is. And so, and most of this review sheet is taken from the PowerPoint. But, generosity, which is not on this, right? He says the person who is too generous is generous to a fault. It's not a virtue. They put themselves at risk by being too generous. But on the other hand, it's also a vice to be stingy, like to be a Scrooge. So the generous person, or generosity, is walking the middle ground between them. And here, temperance, like self-control of our appetites. In the area of food, the excess would be gluttony, asceticism, denial of our appetites for, of food would be at the other end, and self-control, would be the mean between them. Fearing everything and fearing nothing. Well, courage, he says, the midway between those two. Now, how do we achieve the mean? And here's where our reasoning abilities come in. In other words, I may want that second piece of cake, but I'm trying to develop temperance. And so it's my rational part that works against the tendencies of my body to want another piece of cake to develop the virtue of temperance, And so Aristotle says, as reasoning beings, we use our reason to develop these moral characteristics by, avoiding the extreme, essentially. Courage. I need to confront somebody, but I have some fear about doing it, at work. Maybe got some issue, or confronting your boss. But he says, well, override your fear and do it. On the other hand, though, courage is not a total lack of fear. It's not, charging ahead into a hail of bullets. That's just being foolhardy. That's not a virtue. But it's controlling your fear and where it would take it, and using your reasoning abilities as a human being to do that. So the means achieved sometimes contrary to what nature would say. Achieved by reason. Then Aristotle, and Aquinas after him, Aristotle thinks we can draw a sharp line between us and every other living thing. Okay. Now again, after the theory of evolution, it's hard to be able to draw this sharp line, right? In other words, for instance, animal rights activists. If you look at that Peter Singer video, it's one of the extra credit options on what we ought to eat. Animal rights activists would say, well, the difference between human reason and the reasoning of non-human animals is not a difference of kind, but just a difference of degree. But for Aristotle, it's a difference of kind. Only human beings have reason, and maybe the gods, right? So, in other words, what's our essential quality? Well, he says it can't be just having life. Plants have life. Non-human animals have life. It can't be just having biological functions. We share that with non-human animals and plants. It can't be just having an emotional life, because while plants may not have an emotional life, non-human animals do. So that can't be what makes us unique as human beings. What does make us unique? Well, Aristotle says it's our reasoning abilities, our ability to follow a reasoned, argument for something. And so this is where he says that reason is our essential characteristic as human beings, and so our duty is to use our reason to cultivate intellectual virtue and moral virtue. And I drew a diagram in PowerPoint about this. now why be moral? Well, here again, he defines our virtue is these irrational abilities, and Aristotle is convinced that if we use our reasoning abilities to cultivate moral virtues and intellectual virtues, that's the happiest type of life for us, you know. So his answer to why be moral doesn't have so much to do with rewards in an afterlife, because Aristotle was skeptical about an afterlife, but it has to do with, for him, happiness in this life. You know, he thinks that the person with moderate lifestyle is also going to be the happiest person in this life. And you can sort of poo-poo that suggestion, which I did as a younger person, but more and more, you know, it seems to me that sometimes the happiest people are the people with a kind of well-rounded, you know, life with a lot of areas of their life in balance, you know, where they're not going off the extreme in one direction or another, you know. So, I mean, I think Aristotle was on to something. Okay, so virtue is walking the moderate mean, and how do we do it? By using our reason to keep our impulses in check that would have us go to the extremes. Well, okay, again, so I would like to see some essays Thursday. I'll stick with the deal I made. I mean, I'll give you a 3-point bonus if you turn it in early, which is about, you know, a good part of the letter grade. But I'm not going to take off 10 points if it's not in Thursday. You can turn it in without penalty Tuesday. I'll see if I can print out some copies of the, at least the question pool. Probably not the review sheet, because there's no sense handing out copies of the review sheet, but I may have a question pool in printed out form. I mean, no sense handing out copies of the review sheet on the day of the test. So, okay, remember to bring a number 2 pencil. I'll provide the Scantron. I'll have some pencils, but the one way to make sure that you have a good one. Did I? Yeah, I called the roll earlier. Yeah. So let me know. If anybody came in after I called the roll, let me know you're here. And does someone have, or I guess people, yeah, never mind. Oh, I meant to pass this around.
And do you get passed around?
It did get passed, yeah. Okay, good. Very good. Thank you. Yeah, because your name, nobody's name was on there, and yours is on there, so it didn't appear there by magic, and it didn't cause itself to appear, you know.
I don't think.
And it probably didn't have a necessary cause, but it had a cause. So, all right.
I'm still waiting for you to put the first test.
Yeah. I know, and I had so many things that I had to finish that I didn't. I know. I want to get one.
I mean, I can. If you wanted to, I can do it at home. I mean,
no. What I'm going to do, because somebody in the other class has a medical reason and they can't fill out. They can't sit and write a short answer essay test because they're writing. I can't do it. So I thought if I was going to get her an objective multiple choice, that she could just X out the correct answer, you know, then I give you one too.
Okay.
But I just haven't
yeah, just let me know.
done that. Yeah, and what I will do is I'll put it over the test center, and then you all can do it. Or you can take it in my office, you know, prior to the class or something like that. sometimes after, like on Thursdays after the test, I cannot stay. On Tuesdays, usually I can.
Or you just have to let me know because like I said, I have to schedule because my daughter, I have to pick her from daycare and stuff like that.
Okay. Well, that's why, I mean, I'd rather leave it over the test center. And then anytime between now and finals week, you could take that. They will not allow us to give anything but finals during finals week. But between now and then, you'll be able.
Okay, so just let me know when you leave it at the test center and then I'll just make sure.
Okay. Yeah, I'm sorry.
I came to meet.
Okay, yeah, you're,
Very bold.
okay. Right. Okay, great. So, what I said is, I had forgotten that I hadn't gotten to full printouts of things. The essay is not due Thursday. Well, let's put it this way. I told people I'd give them 3 extra points if I got them in on Thursday. What I said is that people, that I would accept them Tuesday without penalty. If they're in after Tuesday, then I'll set it penalty. So, the review session, the review thing and the session tool, I'll try to print out some of the questions for people, if they have a problem with doing it online.
All right.
Okay, so the test is on Thursday.